I remember the exact moment I realized that some secrets are not meant to be uncovered, but inherited. It was the night I found the second child in the nursery, and the night the Duke of Blackwood looked at me with eyes that held more grief than any man should carry alone. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me begin where all stories of this nature must begin, at the point where one life ends and another, however reluctantly, takes its place. I was 23 years old when I buried my husband and my son on the same gray morning in February. Thomas had been a clerk, a good man, with gentle hands and a laugh that could fill our small cottage like sunlight. Our boy, William, had lived only 4 months, just long enough for me to memorize the weight of him in my arms, the particular way he curled his fingers around mine when he slept. The fever took them both within a week of each other, and I stood alone at the churchyard with nothing but the sound of rain against the earth and the terrible silence that follows when everything you love has been lowered into the ground. For 6 months after their deaths, I existed in a kind of waking dream. I took in mending from the village women. I ate when I remembered to eat. I slept only when exhaustion claimed me, because sleep meant waking, and waking meant remembering all over again that the space beside me in bed was empty, that the cradle in the corner would never again hold the warm, breathing weight of my child. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the vicar's wife, who first mentioned the position at Thornfield Hall. She was a practical woman, not unkind, but not given to excessive sentiment, and she sat across from me in my cramped kitchen one afternoon in August, with her hands folded over a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "You cannot continue this way, Eleanor," she said, and her voice was firm but not cruel. "You are young. You have your health. And there is a child at the great house who needs someone exactly like you." I remember looking at her then, truly looking, and feeling something stir beneath the numbness that had become my constant companion. A child? The Duke of Blackwood's daughter, born 3 months ago. The Duchess died in childbirth, God rest her soul, and His Grace has gone through 4 nursemaids already. None of them can seem to manage the girl. She cries constantly, refuses to be soothed. Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward slightly, and I saw something almost like hope in her eyes. "They say she needs a mother's touch, Eleanor, and you, well, you have love to give that has nowhere else to go." I should have been offended by the bluntness of her words, but I was not. She was right after all. The love I had carried for William had not disappeared when he died. It had simply turned inward, become a weight I carried in my chest, heavy and purposeless, and aching to be spent. 3 days later, I found myself in a hired carriage, my single trunk secured to the back. Watching the village I had known my entire life grow smaller and smaller through the window until it vanished entirely beyond a curve in the road. I did not cry. I had no tears left for leaving. All of my grief was already with me, packed as carefully as my few dresses and my mother's Bible, carried in the hollow space beneath my ribs where my heart used to beat with something other than sorrow. Thornfield Hall rose from the landscape like something out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. It was vast and gray and ancient, its stone walls covered in ivy that seemed to clutch at the windows like desperate fingers. Chimneys rose from the roof in irregular clusters, and as the carriage approached, I counted no fewer than 40 windows facing the drive, each one dark and watchful as an eye. I was met at the servants' entrance by Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 50 years with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. She looked me over with an expression that suggested she found me wanting, but was too weary to say so. "You are the new governess, then," she said, and it was not a question. "Yes, ma'am, Eleanor Ashford." She nodded once, sharply, and turned to lead me into the house. "The child is in the East Wing nursery. You will take your meals there with her. His Grace does not wish to be disturbed with domestic matters, and you are not to approach him unless summoned. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "The previous nursemaids," Mrs. Crawford continued, her heels clicking against the marble floors as we walked through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, were dismissed because they could not keep the child quiet. His Grace is a man of solitary habits and particular temperaments. He does not tolerate disruption. I wanted to ask what manner of man could not tolerate the cries of his own infant daughter, but I held my tongue. I was a servant now, and servants did not ask such questions. The nursery was at the end of a long hallway on the second floor, and even before Mrs. Crawford opened the door, I could hear her. Lady Isabel, 3 months old, crying with the desperate, hiccuping sobs of a child who has been crying for so long, she no longer remembers why she started. The room itself was beautiful, in the cold, impersonal way that rooms in great houses often are. The walls were papered in pale blue silk. A fire burned low in the grate. The cradle was carved mahogany, draped in white lace, and probably cost more than my husband had earned in a year of labor. And in that cradle, red-faced and wailing, was the smallest, angriest creature I had ever seen. Mrs. Crawford gestured vaguely toward the child. Lady Isabel, she has been fed and changed within the hour, but she will not settle. Perhaps you will have better luck than the others. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a decisive click, and I was alone with a crying baby and the sudden, overwhelming awareness that I had not held an infant since the morning William died. For a long moment, I simply stood there, my hands trembling at my sides, my breath coming shallow and fast. The sound of Isabel's cries seemed to pierce something deep inside me. Some wound I had thought scarred over, but which was apparently still raw and bleeding beneath the surface. Then, slowly, I walked to the cradle and looked down at her. She was not beautiful, not yet. Her face was scrunched and furious, her tiny fists flailing against the blankets that swaddled her. But her eyes, when they opened between sobs, were a startling shade of gray-blue, the color of storm clouds over the sea. And when she looked at me, truly looked, her crying faltered for just a moment, as if she too recognized something in my face. "Oh, little one," I whispered, and I was surprised to find that my voice was steady. "You are not the only one in this house who has lost someone." I reached into the cradle and lifted her, and the weight of her in my arms was so familiar, so achingly right, that I nearly wept. She was lighter than William had been, and her hair was darker, but the way she nestled against my chest, the way her crying gradually softened to whimpers and then to silence as I rocked her, that was exactly the same. I do not know how long I stood there, swaying gently in the firelight, but by the time I finally laid her back in her cradle, she was asleep. Her tiny chest rose and fell with the peaceful rhythm of dreams, and one small hand had escaped her swaddling to curl loosely against her cheek. I should have felt triumph. I should have felt satisfaction at having accomplished what 4 other women could not. Instead, I felt only grief, vast and deep and quiet, because the child I was soothing was not my child, would never be my child, and the love I was already beginning to feel for her was a borrowed thing, given on loan by a universe that had already proven it could take everything from me without warning or mercy. But I stayed. Of course I stayed. Because Isabel needed me, and because I needed her, and because some bonds are formed not by blood or by choice, but by the simple act of being broken in the same ways. The first weeks at Thornfield Hall passed in a kind of rhythm. I woke with Isabel, fed her, bathed her, walked with her through the long corridors when she grew fussy, and sang to her the same lullabies I had once sung to William. She was a difficult child, quick to cry and slow to settle, but I began to learn her particular needs, the way she liked to be held with her head against my shoulder, the sound of my heartbeat seeming to calm her when nothing else would. I saw almost no one during those early days. Mrs. Crawford checked on me once each morning and once each evening, her sharp eyes scanning the nursery for any sign of disorder. A young maid named Betsy brought my meals on a tray and occasionally lingered to coo at the baby before Mrs. Crawford's disapproving glare sent her scurrying back to her duties. And the Duke himself remained a phantom. a name spoken in whispers by the servants, a presence felt in the heavy silence that seemed to permeate every corner of the great house. I caught glimpses of him sometimes, from a distance. A tall figure crossing the courtyard in the rain, a shadow moving past a window on the third floor. Once, late at night when Isabel would not stop crying, and I had carried her to the window to show her the moonlight on the gardens, I saw him standing alone at the edge of the lake, perfectly still, staring at something I could not see. He was handsome, I suppose, in the cold, carved way that statues are handsome. His hair was dark, his shoulders broad, and even from a distance, I could see that he carried himself with the particular rigidity of a man who has learned to feel nothing, or at least to show nothing, of what he feels. I did not think of him often. I had more pressing concerns after all, and I had learned long ago that men of his station existed in a world entirely separate from my own. He was the Duke of Blackwood, master of Thornfield Hall, father of the child I cared for. I was the governess, a widow of no consequence, employed to perform a service and expected to remain invisible while doing so. But then came the night that changed everything. It was nearly midnight, and a storm had rolled in from the east, rattling the windows and sending drafts through every crack in the old stone walls. Isabel had been asleep for hours, peaceful for once, and I had allowed myself to doze in the chair beside her cradle, too tired to make the journey to my own small room down the hall. I was dreaming of William, of his laugh and the smell of his hair after his bath, when a sound woke me. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the howl of the wind and the drumming of rain against the glass. But as I sat up, blinking in the darkness, I heard it again. A baby crying, not Isabel. I looked immediately to her cradle, and she was still there, still sleeping, her face peaceful in the glow of the dying fire. But the crying continued, muffled and distant, coming from somewhere beyond the nursery door. I told myself I was imagining things, the storm, the exhaustion, the lingering remnants of my dream. But the crying did not stop, and something in the sound of it, something desperate and lonely and afraid, pulled at me in a way I could not ignore. I rose from the chair and moved to the door, opening it as quietly as I could. The corridor beyond was dark, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning through the windows at the far end. The crying was louder here, and as I listened, I realized it was coming from a room at the opposite end of the hall, a room I had been told was unused and kept locked. I should have gone back to bed. I should have told myself it was none of my concern, that I was here to care for Lady Isabel and nothing more. But I could not, because I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that a child was crying in that room. And I could no more ignore that sound than I could stop my own heart from beating. I walked down the corridor, my bare feet silent on the cold stone floor, my nightgown billowing around my ankles with each gust of wind that found its way through the ancient walls. The door at the end was heavy oak, and when I pressed my hand against it, I found it unlocked. Inside, the room was smaller than the main nursery and much more plainly furnished. A single candle burned on a table near the window, casting wavering shadows across the walls. A cradle stood in the corner, simpler than Isabel's but clean and well made. And in that cradle was a baby. A boy, I realized as I drew closer, with dark hair and features that were unmistakably similar to Isabel's. He was perhaps 4 months old, his cheeks wet with tears, his small body trembling with the force of his sobs. A young woman sat beside the cradle, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, and I saw that she was barely more than a girl herself, perhaps 17 or 18, with plain features and reddened eyes. "Please," she whispered, and her voice was thick with exhaustion and fear. "Please, do not tell anyone you found us. I was told to keep him quiet, but he will not stop crying, and I do not know what to do." I stared at her, then at the child, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Who is this baby? Why is he hidden here? Before she could answer, The door behind me opened, and a voice I had heard only once before, from a distance, in the clipped tones of command, spoke into the darkness. "Mrs. Ashford, I see you have discovered my secret." I turned, and the Duke of Blackwood stood in the doorway, rain still glistening in his dark hair, his face as unreadable as the stone walls of his ancestral home. And in that moment, as lightning split the sky outside the window and the unknown child wailed in his forgotten cradle, I realized that Thornfield Hall held far more secrets than I had ever imagined. The Duke's eyes met mine, and what I saw in them was not anger, as I had expected. It was something far more unsettling. It was desperation. "Mrs. Ashford," he said again, and his voice was low, almost pleading. "I must ask you something, and I need you to trust me when I tell you that I cannot explain. Not now. Perhaps not ever." I waited, my heart pounding, the baby's cries fading to whimpers as the young servant lifted him from the cradle and began to rock him with the awkward motions of someone who had not yet learned how. The Duke stepped closer, and I saw that his hands were trembling. "Care for him," he said. "Care for him as you care for Isabel. Feed him, hold him, love him if you can. But please." His voice broke on the word, and for a moment he looked less like a duke and more like a man carrying a burden too heavy for any human heart. "Do not ask me who his mother is. Do not ask me where he came from. Just let him be safe and let me bear this secret alone." I should have refused. I should have demanded answers, explanations, the truth that I was owed as a condition of my continued employment. But I looked at the child, this tiny boy with his father's eyes and his sister's dark hair, and I knew that I could no more abandon him than I could have abandoned William. "What is his name?" I asked. The Duke closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression, something that might, in another man, have been the beginning of trust. "James," he said. "His name is James." And so began the strangest chapter of my life, in a house full of shadows, caring for two children who shared a father and a mystery, bound by a promise I did not yet understand. Falling slowly and impossibly in love with a man who had asked me to accept the one thing I could not bear. Silence, where the truth should have been. I did not sleep that night. How could I, when every certainty I had built in those first quiet weeks at Thornfield Hall had been shattered by a single discovery? After the Duke left, disappearing into the storm-darkened corridors without another word, I stood in that hidden nursery for what felt like hours. The young servant, whose name I learned was Mary, watched me with wide, frightened eyes, the baby James still fussing in her inexperienced arms. "Give him to me," I said finally, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, calm when everything inside me was churning. Mary hesitated only a moment before surrendering the child. He was heavier than Isabel, his cries more insistent, but the moment I settled him against my chest and began the slow, rhythmic swaying that had always soothed William, he quieted. His small hand found the fabric of my nightgown and gripped it, and I felt something crack open inside me, some wall I had not even known I was still building. "How long has he been here?" I asked Mary, keeping my voice low. She twisted her hands in her apron, her gaze darting toward the door as if she expected the Duke to return at any moment. "Since before you came, ma'am. Near 3 months now. I was told to keep him fed and clean and quiet, and to never speak of him to anyone." "Who told you this?" "His Grace himself, ma'am. He brought the child in the night, just as the Duchess was being buried. Said there was no one else who could care for him, and that it had to be kept secret." Mary's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "There are rumors, of course, among the staff. Some say the child is his, born of some woman in the village. Others say worse things." "What worse things?" But Mary only shook her head, her face pale in the candlelight. "I cannot say, ma'am. I do not know what is true and what is gossip, and I will not spread lies about His Grace. He has been kind to me in his way. He pays me well and asks only for my silence." I looked down at James, at his dark lashes wet with tears, at the perfect bow of his mouth, and I knew with absolute certainty that this child was the Duke's son. The resemblance was too strong to deny. Whatever else remained a mystery, that much was clear. But whose son besides the Duke's? That was the question that would haunt me through the long weeks to come. I made my decision that night, standing in that hidden room with a secret child in my arms and a storm raging outside the windows. I would care for James as I cared for Isabel. I would love him, protect him, give him everything I had to give. And I would not ask the Duke for answers he was not ready to provide. It was not trust that drove my decision. I did not trust the Duke of Blackwood, not yet, perhaps not ever. It was something simpler and more selfish than trust. It was the weight of a child in my arms, the soft sound of his breathing as he finally surrendered to sleep, and the knowledge that I had lost too much already to turn away from a baby who needed me. The following morning I spoke with Mrs. Crawford and informed her that I would be taking over the care of both children. She looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, something between relief and suspicion, and asked no questions. I suspected she knew more than she let on, but like all good housekeepers in great houses, she had learned that some knowledge was best left unacknowledged. I moved James's cradle into the main nursery, placing it beside Isabel's. The two children, brother and sister though they might never know it, slept peacefully side by side, and I sat between them through the long hours of the night, watching their chests rise and fall, feeling for the first time since William's death that I had a purpose, a reason to wake each morning and draw breath. The Duke did not come to the nursery, not that day, nor the next, nor for many days after, but I felt his presence nonetheless, in the way the servants whispered when I passed, in the extra coal that appeared in my fireplace without explanation, in the small luxuries that began to arrive unbidden, a new shawl, a book of poetry, a pot of honey for my tea. He was watching, I knew, waiting to see if I would keep my promise. I did. I kept it so thoroughly that there were days I almost forgot there was a mystery at all. I fell into the rhythm of caring for two infants, feeding them, bathing them, singing them to sleep. I learned to love James as fiercely as I loved Isabel, learned the particular way he liked to be held, the sound of his laugh when I tickled his belly, the stubborn set of his jaw when he was displeased. He was a more demanding child than his sister, quicker to cry and harder to soothe. But there was a brightness in him, a spark of something wild and uncontainable that reminded me painfully of William. Weeks passed. The autumn deepened, the leaves turning gold and crimson before falling to carpet the grounds of Thornfield Hall. I walked with the children through the gardens when the weather permitted, pointing out birds and flowers and the way the light fell through the ancient oak trees. The servants began to accept my presence, nodding to me in the corridors, occasionally stopping to admire the babies when they thought no one was watching. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to feel something I had not felt since the morning I buried my husband and son. I began to feel alive. It was on a Sunday in late October that I first spoke to the Duke properly. I had taken the children to the library, a vast room on the ground floor that I had discovered was often deserted in the afternoons. The light there was good for reading, and I had begun the habit of sitting in the window seat with Isabel and James in their baskets at my feet, losing myself for an hour or two in the novels that lined the shelves. I did not hear him enter. I was too absorbed in my book, a Gothic tale of love and loss that struck perhaps too close to my own heart, and when I finally looked up, he was standing by the fireplace, watching me. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and his voice was different than it had been that night in the storm. Softer, less commanding. "I did not mean to disturb you." I set my book aside and rose to my feet, my heart suddenly racing. "Your Grace, I apologize. I did not know the library was occupied. It is not, that is to say, I was merely passing through." He glanced at the baskets, at the two sleeping children, and something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or longing. They look well. They are well, Your Grace. They eat and sleep and grow stronger every day. He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the children. You have done what no one else could. You have made them happy. They are easy to love, I said, and the words came out before I could stop them. The Duke looked at me then, truly looked, and I felt the full weight of his attention like a physical force. His eyes were gray, I realized, the same stormy gray as Isabel's, and there was a depth of suffering in them that I recognized because I had seen it in my own reflection for months after Thomas and William died. You lost a child, he said, and it was not a question. I felt my throat tighten, but I did not look away. A son and a husband. 6 months before I came here. I am sorry. The words were simple, almost inadequate, but the way he spoke them, the rawness in his voice, told me that he understood, that he too knew what it was to lose someone essential, to carry that absence like a wound that would never fully heal. Your wife, I said quietly. The Duchess. I am sorry for your loss as well. He turned away, and for a moment I thought I had overstepped, had presumed too much familiarity with a man so far above my station. But when he spoke again, his voice was steady. Catherine was ill for a long time before Isabel was born. The doctors warned us that another pregnancy would be dangerous, but she wanted a child so desperately. She said she would rather die giving life than live without having given it. He paused, and I saw his hands clench at his sides. I should have refused her. I should have protected her from her own desires, but I loved her, and I could not deny her the one thing she wanted most. I did not know what to say. I had no words that could ease a grief that deep, a guilt that consuming. So I said nothing, and the silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we could not speak. Finally, the Duke turned back to face me. The boy, he said, and his voice was careful now, measured. James, you have asked me nothing about him. You asked me not to. I did, and I am grateful that you honored that request. He took a step closer, and I could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the shadows that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But I find myself in an impossible position, Mrs. Ashford. You have earned my trust through your actions, and yet I cannot tell you the truth without risking everything. Then do not tell me, I said, and I was surprised by the firmness in my own voice. Tell me only what I need to know to care for him. The rest can wait until you are ready. He stared at me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but something close to it. Something that made my heart beat faster and my cheeks flush with heat I could not explain. You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Ashford, he said finally, more remarkable than you know. Before I could respond, he turned and walked from the library, leaving me alone with 2 sleeping children and a confusion of feelings I did not know how to name. That night, I lay awake in my narrow bed and thought about the Duke of Blackwood. I thought about the pain in his eyes and the tremor in his voice when he spoke of his wife. I thought about the way he had looked at James, with a longing so profound it seemed to fracture him from within. And I thought about the question that circled endlessly through my mind, the question I had promised not to ask. Who was James's mother? The obvious answer, the one that the servants whispered and that society would certainly assume, was that the Duke had taken a mistress, that James was the product of an affair hidden away to protect the family's reputation. It was a common enough story among the aristocracy, where men kept their pleasures separate from their marriages, and bastard children were raised in secrecy and shame. But something about that explanation did not fit. The Duke's grief for his wife had seemed genuine, all-consuming, and the way he looked at James was not the detached tolerance of a man confronting his own indiscretion. It was something deeper, more desperate, more afraid. There was another possibility, one that I could barely bring myself to consider. What if James was not the Duke's child at all? What if he was protecting someone else, taking on a burden that was not his to bear? I thought of the young servant Mary, of her nervousness and her loyalty, and the way she had refused to meet my eyes when I asked about the rumors. I thought of the way the Duke had appeared that night in the storm, rain-soaked and wild-eyed, as if he had been running from something or toward something he could not escape. And I thought of Catherine, the Duchess, dead in childbirth, her body barely cold before a second child appeared in the house that was meant to hold only one. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it did, I dreamed of secrets buried in dark earth, of babies crying in rooms without windows, of a man standing at the edge of a lake with his hands outstretched toward something he could not reach. The weeks that followed were strangely peaceful. The Duke and I did not speak again at length, but I began to see him more often, passing in corridors, walking in the gardens, sitting alone in the chapel that stood at the edge of the estate. Each time our eyes met, I felt a jolt of something electric, something I tried very hard to deny. I was a widow, a servant, a woman of no fortune and no prospects. Whatever I was beginning to feel for the Duke of Blackwood was not only impossible, but dangerous. If I allowed myself to care for him, truly care for him, I would be setting myself up for heartbreak far worse than anything I had already endured. And yet I could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at me in the library, as if he saw something in me that no one else had ever seen. I could not stop remembering the raw honesty in his voice when he spoke of his wife, the vulnerability that seemed so at odds with his cold, commanding exterior. I could not stop wondering what it would feel like to be held by him, to be comforted by him, to be loved by him in the way that Catherine had been loved before everything fell apart. It was foolish. It was reckless. It was utterly, completely impossible. But love, I was beginning to learn, does not concern itself with possibility. It grows where it will, in the most inhospitable soil, reaching toward light that may never come. November arrived with a bitter frost and the first whispers of scandal. I learned of it from Betsy, the young maid who had always been kind to me, who slipped into the nursery one afternoon with a basket of clean linens and a face full of poorly concealed excitement. "Have you heard, ma'am?" she whispered, glancing toward the door as if she expected Mrs. Crawford to materialize at any moment. "About the visitor?" I was folding blankets, trying to coax James into his afternoon nap, and I did not look up. "What visitor?" "Lady Hartwell, ma'am, the Duke's sister. She arrived this morning from London, and the whole house is in an uproar." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The Duke's sister. In all my weeks at Thornfield Hall, no one had mentioned that he had a sister. "What does she want?" Betsy lowered her voice further. "No one knows for certain, ma'am, but there is talk that she has heard rumors about the children, about you." I stopped folding. "About me?" "People talk, ma'am. They say you have bewitched his grace, that you have turned his head with your widow's wiles." Betsy's cheeks flushed. "I do not believe it, of course, but Lady Hartwell is known to be proud and protective of the family name, if she suspects anything improper." She did not need to finish the sentence. I understood perfectly well what would happen if the Duke's sister decided I was a threat. I would be dismissed without reference, cast out into the cold with nothing but the clothes on my back and the memory of 2 children I had come to love as my own. "Thank you for warning me," I said quietly, and Betsy nodded before slipping back out of the nursery. I did not have to wait long to meet Lady Hartwell. She came to the nursery that very evening, sweeping through the door without knocking, her silk skirts rustling with every step. She was perhaps 30 years old, beautiful in the sharp, polished way of women who have never known want, with dark hair piled high on her head and eyes that missed nothing. "So," she said, stopping in the center of the room and surveying me with undisguised contempt. "You are the governess my brother has been hiding in his house." I rose from my chair and curtsied, keeping my expression neutral. "I am Eleanor Ashford, my lady. I care for Lady Isabel." "And the other child?" Lady Hartwell's gaze swept to the second cradle, to James sleeping peacefully with his thumb in his mouth. I was not aware my brother had 2 children. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. The household arrangements are not mine to discuss, my lady. If you have questions, I suggest you direct them to His Grace. Lady Hartwell's eyes narrowed. You are bold for a servant. I am honest, my lady. There is a difference. For a long moment, she simply stared at me, and I felt the full force of her aristocratic displeasure bearing down on me like a physical weight. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Perhaps there is hope for you yet, she said, and turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. My brother has suffered greatly, Mrs. Ashford. Whatever secrets he keeps for reasons that would break lesser men. I came here prepared to despise you, but I find myself reconsidering. Perhaps you are exactly what this house needs. And then she was gone, leaving me alone with the children, and a confusion of emotions I could not begin to untangle. That night, after the children were asleep, I walked to the window and looked out at the frost-covered gardens. Somewhere in this house, the Duke was carrying a burden he could not share. Somewhere, Lady Hartwell was reconsidering her judgment of me. Somewhere, a secret was waiting to be revealed, and I knew with terrible certainty that when it finally came to light, nothing would ever be the same. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and whispered a prayer to no one in particular. Let me be strong enough, I said. Whatever comes, let me be strong enough to bear it. The frost glittered in the moonlight, and the house settled into silence around me, and I waited for the truth that I knew was coming, even if I did not yet know what shape it would take. The truth came to me not all at once, but in pieces, like a puzzle assembled in the dark by trembling hands. The first piece arrived 3 days after Lady Hartwell's visit, when I found a letter tucked beneath the door of the nursery. It was sealed with wax that bore no crest, written in a flowing, feminine hand that I did not recognize. I waited until both children were sleeping before I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The words were brief, almost brutal in their directness. If you wish to understand the child you care for, go to the chapel at midnight. Come alone. Tell no one. The truth will set you free, or it will destroy you. Perhaps both. It was unsigned. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking, trying to decide if this was some cruel trick or a genuine offer of knowledge. Everything in me that was cautious, that had learned to survive by keeping my head down and my questions unspoken, told me to burn the letter and forget I had ever received it. But I could not. The need to know had taken root inside me, growing stronger with each passing day. Each time I looked at James and wondered whose eyes he had inherited, whose smile lurked beneath his infant features, whose secret shame or scandal had forced him into hiding. I went to the chapel that night. I wrapped myself in my warmest cloak, checked twice that both children were sleeping soundly, and slipped from the nursery into the cold November darkness. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to light my way across the frost-hardened ground, and my breath came out in pale clouds as I walked. The chapel was small and ancient, built of the same gray stone as the main house, with narrow windows that glowed faintly from within. Someone had lit candles inside. I could see their flickering light as I approached, hear the whisper of movement from beyond the heavy oak door. I hesitated with my hand on the latch, fear warring with curiosity, caution with desire. Then I thought of James, of his infant innocence and the weight of secrets he would someday have to carry, and I pushed the door open. Lady Hartwell stood before the altar, her face pale in the candlelight, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was not alone. Beside her stood a woman I had never seen before, older than Lady Hartwell but younger than Mrs. Crawford, with red-rimmed eyes and a mourning dress that had seen better days. "Mrs. Ashford," Lady Hartwell said, and her voice echoed strangely in the empty space. "Thank you for coming. I was not certain you would." "You wrote the letter," I said, though it was not a question. "I did. because someone must tell you the truth, and my brother is too much a coward to do it himself." Lady Hartwell's expression was hard, unforgiving. "This is Mrs. Anne Pembroke. She was my sister-in-law's lady's maid. She was with Catherine the night she died." I looked at the other woman, at the grief etched into every line of her face, and felt something cold creep up my spine. What does this have to do with James? Mrs. Pembroke spoke then, her voice rough, as if she had spent too many nights weeping. "Everything, ma'am. It has everything to do with that innocent child, and with the lie that has poisoned this house since the Duchess drew her last breath." She stepped forward, and in the candlelight I could see tears glistening on her cheeks. "Lady Catherine did not die in childbirth, Mrs. Ashford. That is to say, she did die bringing a child into this world, but not the child everyone believes." My mind struggled to make sense of her words. "I do not understand." "Lady Isabel was born, healthy and strong," Mrs. Pembroke continued, her voice breaking. "But the labor was long and difficult, and the Duchess was weakened by it, bleeding in a way the doctors could not stop. She lingered for 3 days, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost in fever, and in her lucid moments she made me promise something terrible." Lady Hartwell placed a hand on Mrs. Pembroke's shoulder, steadying her. "Tell her," she said softly. "She deserves to know." Mrs. Pembroke drew a shuddering breath. "The Duchess had a younger sister, Miss Margaret. She was a wild girl, beautiful and reckless, always causing scandal with her behavior. She had run away from home 2 years before, cut off from the family entirely after some disgrace I was never told about. The Duchess had not spoken to her in all that time, had forbidden even the mention of her name. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. But 3 nights after Lady Isabel was born, while the Duchess lay dying, a woman came to the servants' entrance. She was thin and ill, dressed in rags, and she carried a baby boy wrapped in a dirty shawl. She begged to see her sister, said she had nowhere else to go, no one else who would help her. I felt the chapel floor tilt beneath my feet, felt the world I thought I understood crumbling into something unrecognizable. Margaret was James's mother. "Yes," Mrs. Pembroke said. "She had given birth to him in some charity hospital in London, and she was dying. Consumption, the doctor said later. She did not have more than a few days left, if that. She begged the Duchess to take her child, to raise him as her own, to give him the life she could never provide." "And Catherine agreed," Lady Hartwell said, her voice sharp with something that might have been admiration or condemnation. I could not tell which. "Even as she lay dying herself, even knowing she would not live to protect the child, she agreed. She made my brother promise to take the boy, to keep him safe, to never reveal his true parentage because it would destroy Margaret's memory and damn the child to a life of shame." I pressed my hand against the wall, needing something solid to keep me upright. "The Duke is not James's father." "No," Lady Hartwell said. "He is his uncle, but he has let the world believe otherwise, has accepted the whispers and the scandal and the judgment, because it is easier to be thought an adulterer than to reveal that his wife's sister bore a bastard child and died in disgrace." Mrs. Pembroke wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "Margaret died the same night as the Duchess. I watched them both slip away, one in the great bedroom upstairs and one in a servant's room in the east wing where no one of consequence would ever see her. The Duke buried them both in secret. Catherine in the family plot with all ceremony, and Margaret in an unmarked grave at the edge of the estate. And he took the boy and swore he would raise him as his own, though he could never acknowledge him publicly without destroying everything Catherine had tried to protect. The pieces fell into place then, a terrible picture emerging from the fragments I had been given. The Duke's desperate plea that first night, asking me not to question him. His grief, which was not just for a wife lost, but for a promise made that bound him to secrecy forever. The way he looked at James, with love and pain and the crushing weight of obligation. "Why tell me this now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Why not let me go on believing the lie?" Lady Hartwell's expression softened slightly. "Because you love him, both of them, the children and my brother. I have seen the way you look at him, Mrs. Ashford, and I have seen the way he looks at you. You are the first thing that has brought light to this house since Catherine died, and I will not let you walk into darkness unprepared." I wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that whatever I felt for the Duke was merely respect or gratitude, or the natural sympathy of one grieving person for another. But the words would not come, because they would have been lies, and I was so tired of lies. "He can never marry me," I said instead, "even if he wanted to, which he does not. I am a widow of no fortune, a servant. The scandal would be unthinkable." "Perhaps," Lady Hartwell said, "or perhaps there are things more important than scandal. My brother has lived under the weight of duty and obligation his entire life. He married Catherine because it was expected of him, though I believe he did grow to love her in his way. He has sacrificed his reputation to honor her dying wish. How much more must he sacrifice before he is allowed to choose something for himself?" She moved closer, her eyes searching mine. "I am not saying he will choose you, Mrs. Ashford. I am not even saying he should. But I am saying that you deserve to know the truth before you give your heart to a man who may not be able to give his in return. The rest is up to you." I left the chapel in a daze, my mind reeling with everything I had learned. The walk back to the house seemed longer than it had been before, the darkness more profound, the cold more piercing. By the time I reached the nursery, I was shivering uncontrollably, though whether from the temperature or from shock, I could not say. Both children were still sleeping, blissfully unaware of the revelations that had just reshaped their world. I stood between their cradles and looked down at them, these two souls who had been born into such different circumstances, but who were bound together now by tragedy and love and the promises of the dying. Isabel, legitimate and titled, heir to everything her father possessed. James, illegitimate and hidden, condemned to live in the shadows unless the Duke found the courage to claim him despite the cost. And I, who had lost everything and found it again in the most impossible place, now faced with a choice I had never wanted to make. I could leave, pack my few belongings, take my wages, and disappear into the anonymity of some other household where the secrets were less dangerous and my heart was less engaged. It would be the sensible thing, the safe thing. I would survive as I had always survived, or I could stay. I could continue to love these children and the man who had taken them both as his own. I could accept that I might never have more than this, stolen moments and unspoken feelings, and the knowledge that I was important to someone who could never truly be mine. I stayed. Of course I stayed. Because I had already lost too much to walk away from the little I had found, and because the Duke of Blackwood needed someone who knew his secrets and loved him anyway, and because those two children deserved to grow up with someone who saw them not as problems to be managed or scandals to be hidden, but as miracles to be cherished. The days that followed were strange and charged with tension. Lady Hartwell remained at Thornfield Hall, her presence a constant reminder of the conversation in the chapel. She took to visiting the nursery in the afternoons, sitting with me while I fed the children or walked them in the gardens, speaking of inconsequential things that somehow made everything feel less heavy. "You are good for them," she said to me one afternoon, watching as I coaxed Isabel into trying a spoonful of mashed vegetables. "And for my brother. I have not seen him smile in months. But yesterday I heard him laugh at something you said about James's appetite. It was a small thing, but it mattered." I did not know how to respond to that, so I focused on Isabel, on wiping the mess from her chin and praising her for being such a brave girl. "He will never be able to marry someone of his own class now," Lady Hartwell continued, and her tone was thoughtful rather than judgmental. The scandal of a second marriage so soon after Catherine's death would be bad enough, but combined with the rumors about James, no respectable family would allow their daughter to be associated with him. He is damaged goods in society's eyes. Ruined. That is unfair, I said quietly. He has done nothing wrong. He has only tried to honor his wife's wishes and protect an innocent child. I agree completely, Lady Hartwell said, and there was something like satisfaction in her voice. Which is why I think it would be perfectly acceptable for him to marry someone who cares nothing for society's opinion. Someone who has already lost everything and therefore has nothing left to lose. Someone who loves his children and might perhaps learn to love him as well. I set down the spoon, my hands trembling. My lady, I cannot. The difference in our stations is nothing compared to the difference in your characters, Lady Hartwell interrupted. You have more integrity in your little finger than most aristocratic ladies have in their entire beings. And my brother needs someone who sees him as a man, not as a title or a fortune. Someone who will stand beside him when the world turns against him, as it inevitably will when the truth about James eventually comes to light. You think the secret will not hold? Lady Hartwell's expression turned grim. I think secrets like this never hold forever. Someone will talk. Some servant will carry tales to another household. Some clever gossip will piece together the timeline and realize that Catherine could not have given birth to 2 children 3 months apart. And when that happens, my brother will need all the allies he can muster. She stood then, smoothing her skirts with practiced elegance. Think about what I have said, Mrs. Ashford, and remember that sometimes the most scandalous choice is also the most right. I thought about little else in the days that followed. I thought about it while I fed the children, and while I sang them to sleep. I thought about it while I walked through the frost-covered gardens, and while I sat alone in my room at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine a future that seemed impossible. The Duke and I had not spoken at length since the afternoon in the library, but I was acutely aware of him in a way I had not been before. I noticed when he passed through corridors where I was likely to be. I noticed the way his gaze would linger on me when he thought I was not looking. I noticed the small considerations, the way he ensured I had everything I needed, the way he asked Mrs. Crawford about my welfare as if my comfort mattered to him. And I began to wonder if perhaps Lady Hartwell was right. If perhaps there was a future here, unlikely and improper and absolutely against every rule of society, but real nonetheless. The second revelation came on a Sunday afternoon in early December, when the Duke finally summoned me to his study. Mrs. Crawford delivered the message with her usual efficiency, informing me that His Grace requested my presence at 4 o'clock and that I should dress appropriately. I had no idea what that meant, no frame of reference for what appropriate attire looked like when summoned by a duke who might or might not be developing feelings for his children's governess. I wore my best dress, a dark blue wool that had belonged to my mother and which I had altered to fit me after her death. I pinned my hair as neatly as I could and tried to calm my racing heart as I made my way through the corridors to the south wing, where the Duke's private rooms were located. His study was everything one would expect of a place where important decisions were made. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books lining the walls, a massive desk positioned before tall windows that looked out over the estate, and the Duke himself, standing by the fire, dressed in riding clothes, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Ashford, he said, and gestured to a chair positioned before the desk. Please, sit. I sat, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling, and waited. The Duke did not sit. He paced instead, moving back and forth before the fire like a caged animal, his movements restless and agitated. Finally, he stopped and turned to face me. My sister tells me she has revealed the truth about James, he said, and his voice was carefully neutral. I assume you now understand why I could not tell you myself. I do, Your Grace, and yet you have not left. You have not demanded higher wages for keeping such a dangerous secret, You have not threatened to expose me or blackmail me or do any of the things a more calculating person might have done." He moved closer, his gray eyes boring into mine. "Why?" I met his gaze steadily. "Because I love those children, both of them, and because I understand what it is to make promises to the dying. You did what Catherine asked of you, what her sister needed, what James deserved. There is no shame in that." Society would disagree. "Society," I said, with more force than I intended, "can go to the devil. I care nothing for what society thinks, and neither should you." For a long moment, he simply stared at me. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was a harsh, broken sound. But it was genuine, and it transformed his face into something younger, less burdened. "You are extraordinary," he said, and the words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised me. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known." "I am a widow and a governess," I said, suddenly desperate to maintain some distance between us, some acknowledgement of the impossible gulf that separated our worlds. "I am nothing special." "You are everything," he said, and the intensity in his voice made my breath catch. "You are brave and kind and honest. You have brought life back to this house. You have made me remember what it feels like to hope." He crossed the room then, moving with a sudden decisiveness that left me no time to prepare. He knelt before my chair, taking my hands in his, and I felt the warmth of his touch like a brand. "I cannot offer you what you deserve," he said, and his voice was raw with emotion. "I cannot give you a grand courtship or a respectable engagement or a wedding that would satisfy your family and friends. But I can offer you my heart, such as it is. I can offer you a place at my side, as my wife, if you will have me, and a lifetime of devotion to you and to the children we will raise together." I stared at him, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to do anything but feel the weight of this impossible moment pressing down on me. "You want to marry me," I whispered. "I want to marry you," he confirmed. "Scandal be damned. Reputation be damned. I want to wake beside you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, here at Thornfield Hall, and face whatever consequences come together." "They will say terrible things," I said, even as my heart soared with a hope I had thought long dead. "They will call me a fortune hunter and worse. They will say I bewitched you or manipulated you or took advantage of your grief." "Let them say what they will," he said fiercely. "I know the truth. You know the truth. That is enough." I looked into his eyes, at the desperate hope I saw there, at the vulnerability that he had finally allowed himself to show me. And I thought about everything I had lost and everything I had found, about the impossibility of love and the stubborn way it insisted on growing anyway. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like a leap off a cliff into unknown darkness. "Yes, I will marry you." He pulled me from the chair then, into his arms, and held me as if I were something precious and fragile and essential. And I held him back. This complicated man with his terrible secrets and his boundless capacity for love. And I knew that I had made the right choice, even if it was the hardest one. Whatever came next, whatever storms we would have to weather, we would face them together. And that, I was beginning to understand, was what love truly meant. We were married 3 weeks later in the chapel, where Lady Hartwell had revealed the truth to me, with only his sister and Mrs. Crawford as witnesses. It was not the wedding I had once imagined for myself, not the joyful celebration with flowers and music and a church full of well-wishers that I had shared with Thomas. But it was honest, and it was ours. And when the Duke placed a simple gold band on my finger and spoke the words that bound us together, I felt something shift inside me, some final wall crumbling to let in light I had not known I was missing. The scandal, as predicted, was immediate and spectacular. Within a week of our marriage, The gossip had spread throughout the county. The Duke of Blackwood, barely a year after his wife's death, had married his children's governess, a woman of no family, no fortune, no connections, a widow who had clearly entrapped a grieving man in his moment of weakness. The whispers followed us everywhere, in the village when we attended church, in the letters that arrived daily from shocked and disapproving relatives, in the cold silence of neighbors who had once bowed and scraped before the Duke and now turned away when they saw us approaching. I had known it would be difficult. I had prepared myself for judgment and condemnation. But knowing and experiencing are two different things, and there were days when the weight of public disapproval felt almost unbearable. It was the Duke who sustained me through those early weeks. He faced the scandal with a courage I had not known he possessed, refusing to apologize or explain or show any shame for his choice. When Lady Pemberton crossed the street to avoid speaking to me, he took my arm more firmly and held his head higher. When his own cousin sent a letter denouncing the marriage as a disgrace to the family name, he burned it in the library fireplace and kissed me with a passion that left no doubt about his commitment. "Let them talk," he told me one evening as we sat together in the drawing room, the children playing on a blanket at our feet. "Their opinions mean nothing to me. You are my wife, Eleanor. You are the Duchess of Blackwood now, and no amount of gossip will change that." The title still felt strange on my tongue, impossible and slightly ridiculous. I, who had been born in a cottage and raised on porridge and mended clothes, was now a duchess. I had servants who curtsied to me, a wardrobe full of gowns I did not know how to wear properly, and a position in society that I had never sought and did not want. But I had something more important than any of that. I had a husband who looked at me as if I were the answer to prayers he had not known how to speak. I had 2 children who called me Mama and reached for me when they were frightened or hurt or simply needed comfort. I had a home, a purpose, and a future that stretched before me with possibilities I had never dared to imagine. Still, the secret of James's parentage hung over us like a sword suspended by a thread. We did not speak of it often, but it was always there, in the careful way we introduced him to visitors, in the vague explanations we offered when people asked why the Duke had 2 children so close in age, in the knowledge that discovery could come at any moment and destroy everything we had built. It was Lady Hartwell who first broached the subject of what we would tell the children when they were old enough to ask questions. She had remained at Thornfield Hall after our marriage, taking on the role of chaperone and advisor, with the efficiency that suggested she had been waiting for just such an opportunity. She was fiercely protective of both the Duke and me, deflecting the worst of the gossip with cutting remarks and strategic social maneuvering, and I grew to love her as the sister I had never had. We were in the morning room one afternoon in January, the children napping upstairs, when she set down her teacup and fixed me with a penetrating stare. "You will need to decide soon," she said without preamble, "about what James will be told, about what he will be called." I glanced at the Duke, who had been reading correspondence at the desk by the window. He set down his pen and turned to face us, his expression troubled. "I have been considering that question since Catherine died," he admitted. "I do not know what the right answer is. If I acknowledge him publicly as my nephew, Catherine's sister's child, I expose him to the shame of illegitimacy. If I continue to let people believe he is my son, born of some affair, I protect his legitimacy at the cost of my own reputation and Eleanor's." "There is a third option," Lady Hartwell said carefully. "You could simply say nothing. Let people draw their own conclusions. James can be raised as Isabel's brother, with all the privileges of the family, and the question of his exact parentage can remain unanswered. It is not ideal, but it may be the kindest approach for the children." I considered this, turning it over in my mind. But what happens when James is older? When he wants to know who his mother was, why he looks so much like Isabel but has no memory of the Duchess? We cannot lie to him forever. "No," the Duke agreed quietly. "We cannot. but perhaps we can give him a childhood free from the burden of knowing. Let him be innocent for as long as possible. The truth will find him eventually, as truth always does. But it need not find him yet. It was decided then, though none of us felt entirely comfortable with the decision. James would be raised as the Duke's son, Isabel's twin brother, and the questions would be deferred until they could no longer be avoided. It was a compromise, imperfect and fraught with potential complications, but it was the best we could manage given the impossible circumstances. The winter passed slowly, marked by small victories and larger fears. Isabel took her first steps in February, tottering between the Duke and me with a delighted squeal. James followed a week later, more cautious but equally determined. I watched them grow and learn and play together, these two children who shared so much and yet carried such different legacies, and I marveled at the resilience of innocence. My relationship with the Duke deepened in ways I had not anticipated. We were not the passionate young lovers of romantic novels, consumed by desire and oblivious to everything but each other. We were something quieter, more solid. We were two people who had both known profound loss and who had found in each other a safe harbor from the storms of grief and scandal. He was tender with me in ways that surprised us both. He would seek me out in the middle of the day just to hold my hand for a moment, to share some small observation about the children or the estate, or nothing in particular. At night, in the privacy of our bedroom, he held me as if I were precious, as if he could not quite believe I was real and might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly. And I loved him. Not with the innocent, uncomplicated love I had felt for Thomas, but with something deeper and more complex, a love built on shared secrets and mutual respect, and the knowledge that we had both been broken and had somehow found a way to mend each other. It was in late March that the first real threat to our fragile peace arrived. A letter came, addressed to the Duke, bearing a seal I did not recognize. He opened it at breakfast, his expression calm until he began to read. Then I saw his face go pale, saw his hands tighten on the paper until his knuckles turned white. "What is it?" I asked, setting down my own correspondence. He did not answer immediately. He simply stared at the letter, his jaw clenched, his breathing shallow. Finally, he looked up at me, and I saw something that might have been fear in his eyes. "It is from a man named Edward Reeves," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "He claims to have been Margaret's lover, James's father." The room seemed to tilt. "What does he want?" "Money," the Duke said bitterly. "What else? He says he knows James is being raised here, knows the boy is his son, and unless I pay him a substantial sum, he will go to the newspapers with his story. He will tell them everything. About Margaret, about the illegitimacy, about Catherine's role in hiding the child." Lady Hartwell, who had been present at breakfast, set down her teacup with a decisive clink. "He is bluffing. He must be. How could he possibly know any of this?" "Mrs. Pembroke," the Duke said heavily. "It has to be. She was the only one besides the three of us who knew the whole story. She must have told someone, or been overheard, or somehow let the information slip." I thought of the grieving woman I had met in the chapel, of her tears and her obvious devotion to the late Duchess. She would not betray Catherine's memory. I cannot believe it. "People do terrible things when they are desperate," the Duke said, "and we do not know what circumstances Mrs. Pembroke might have found herself in after she left our employ. Perhaps she needed money. Perhaps she was coerced. It does not matter now. What matters is that this man has information that could destroy us, and we must decide how to respond." Lady Hartwell leaned forward, her expression fierce. "You cannot pay him. If you do, he will only demand more. Blackmailers are never satisfied with one payment. He will bleed you dry, and then expose you anyway." "But if I do not pay him," the Duke said quietly, "he will go to the papers immediately. Eleanor will be humiliated. The children will be branded with scandal. Everything we have tried to protect will be torn apart. I reached across the table and took his hand. Then we tell the truth ourselves, before he can. We control the narrative, explain Catherine's compassion and your loyalty, and face the consequences together. The Duke stared at me as if I had suggested we burn down the house. You do not know what you are asking. The scandal would be enormous. You would be scorned, whispered about, cut from society entirely. I am already scorned and whispered about, I reminded him gently. And I have never cared for society's approval. What I care about is protecting our children and preserving our integrity. We cannot live under the threat of blackmail for the rest of our lives, wondering when the axe will fall. Better to face it now, on our terms, than to let some villain dictate our fate. Lady Hartwell nodded slowly. She is right. Much as I hate to admit it, Eleanor is absolutely right. We must be proactive. Write to the newspapers ourselves, explain the situation with dignity and honesty, and trust that there are still people in this world who value compassion over scandal. The Duke looked between us. These two women who had somehow become his allies in an impossible situation, and I saw the moment he made his decision. His shoulders straightened, his jaw set, and when he spoke, his voice was firm. Very well, we tell the truth, all of it. We explain that Catherine, in her final act of generosity, took in her sister's illegitimate child and asked me to raise him as my own. We make no apologies for the deception because it was done out of love and mercy. And we face whatever comes with our heads held high. The letter we composed together that afternoon was a masterpiece of careful honesty. We acknowledged James's true parentage, explained the circumstances of his birth and the promises made by Catherine on her deathbed, and made clear that our intention had always been to protect an innocent child from the stigma of illegitimacy. We sent copies to every major newspaper in London, to our family members and closest neighbors, and to Edward Reeves himself, informing him that his leverage had been eliminated and any attempt to extort us further would be met with legal action. Then we waited. The response was not what we expected. Yes, there was scandal. Yes, there were those who condemned us, who called Catherine's mercy foolish and the Duke's devotion misplaced. But there were also, to my great surprise, voices of support. Letters arrived from people we had never met, praising Catherine's compassion and the Duke's integrity. Several prominent figures in society publicly defended us, arguing that protecting a child should never be considered shameful. Even the newspapers, which I had expected to savage us, were relatively measured in their coverage, presenting our story with a fairness that suggested not everyone in the world was motivated purely by scandal and spite. Edward Reeves disappeared. Whether he was frightened off by our preemptive revelation or simply decided we were no longer worth the effort, we never learned. Mrs. Pembroke sent a tearful letter apologizing for her role in the leak, explaining that she had been living in poverty and had confided in a friend who betrayed her trust. The Duke sent her money and forgiveness, because what else could we do? We were all struggling to survive in a world that offered no easy answers. The hardest part was telling the children. Not immediately, of course. They were still far too young to understand. But we knew the day would come when James would ask questions, when he would notice that his memories of his mother were entirely absent, when he would wonder why people sometimes looked at him with pity or curiosity. We decided that when that day came, we would tell him the truth with love. We would explain that his mother was a woman who made mistakes, but who loved him enough to ensure he would be cared for. We would tell him that his Aunt Catherine saw him as a gift rather than a burden, and that his uncle, the Duke, had chosen to be his father in every way that mattered. We would tell him that families are not always built by blood, but by the choices we make and the promises we keep. And we would tell him that he was loved, fiercely, completely, unconditionally, that he was wanted, that he belonged, because in the end, that was all any of us could hope for. By the time spring arrived in full, with daffodils blooming in the gardens and the children growing strong enough to run and play outside, I felt as if we had weathered the worst of the storm. The scandal had not destroyed us. The secret had not torn us apart. We had faced the truth together and emerged battered but intact. One afternoon in April, I found the Duke standing by the lake where I had first seen him months ago, staring out at the water with an expression of profound peace. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, slipping my hand into his. He smiled, the smile that still surprised me every time I saw it because it transformed his entire face into something young and hopeful. "I am thinking that I have been given a second chance at happiness, that against all odds and expectations, I found someone who sees me not as a title or a burden, but as simply a man. Someone who loves my children as her own and who has made this house feel like a home again." He turned to face me, cupping my cheek with his hand. "I am thinking that I do not deserve you, Eleanor, but I am grateful beyond measure that you chose me anyway." I leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of the spring sun on my face and the steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. "We chose each other," I corrected gently, "and we will keep choosing each other every day for the rest of our lives." He kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and I tasted the future in that kiss, all the years we would have together, all the challenges we would face and overcome, all the love we would build from the broken pieces of our pasts. Behind us, I heard the sound of children laughing, Isabel and James running through the gardens with Lady Hartwell calling after them to be careful. It was the sound of life, messy and beautiful and imperfect. It was the sound of home. And as I stood there in my husband's arms, watching our children play in the sunlight, I understood with perfect clarity that this was what redemption looked like. Not the absence of mistakes or the erasure of pain, but the courage to build something new from the ruins of what was lost. We had been broken, all of us. The Duke with his grief and his impossible promises. The children with their complicated parentage and uncertain futures. And I, with my devastating losses and my fear of loving again. But we had found each other in the wreckage. And together, we had built something strong enough to withstand the storms. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 5 years later, I stood at the window of the nursery, now converted into a schoolroom, and watched my children play in the gardens below. They were no longer babies. These two souls who had come into my life bearing secrets and sorrows too heavy for such small shoulders to carry. They were children now, vibrant and alive, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze like music. Isabel was 7, tall for her age and graceful in the way her mother had been. She had Catherine's gentle nature, but also a quiet strength that surprised everyone who knew her. She was teaching James how to climb the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the lawn, patient and encouraging, even when he hesitated on the lower branches. James was 6, or perhaps 7. We had never been entirely certain of his exact birth date, one more small tragedy in a life that had begun with so many. He was smaller than his sister, more cautious, but there was a brightness in him that drew people like moths to flame. He had his mother's red hair we had discovered as he grew, and his father's hazel eyes, though we never spoke of Edward Reeves in his presence. As far as James knew, the Duke was his father in every way that mattered, and that was the truth, the one that counted. The past 5 years had not been easy. We had faced continued scandal, social ostracism, and the constant challenge of raising 2 children whose parentage would always invite speculation and judgment. But we had also found joy in unexpected places. We had built a life together, the Duke and I, based not on propriety or convenience, but on genuine love and mutual respect. He had changed in those years. The cold, distant man I had first encountered had thawed gradually, revealing someone capable of deep tenderness and surprising humor. He played with the children, read them stories, carried them on his shoulders through the estate. He held my hand when we walked, kissed me goodbye each morning, and told me at least once a day that marrying me was the best decision he had ever made. And I had changed too. The grief-stricken widow, who had arrived at Thornfield Hall with nothing but sorrow in her heart, had discovered that it was possible to love again, to hope again, to build a future from the ashes of loss. I was the Duchess of Blackwood now, a title I had never wanted but had learned to wear with a dignity that surprised even me. Society had eventually grudgingly accepted us. Not fully, perhaps. There were still those who whispered behind their fans at balls, who excluded us from certain gatherings, who made it clear that our unconventional marriage would never be entirely forgiven. But there were also those who had come to respect us, who saw in our story not scandal, but courage. We had been invited to fewer events than other families of our rank, but the invitations we did receive were from people whose opinions we actually valued. Lady Hartwell had remained our staunchest ally. She had never married, choosing instead to make Thornfield Hall her permanent home. She was aunt to the children, sister to me, and confidant to the Duke. The three of us had formed a family unit that was unusual but undeniably strong. It was Lady Hartwell who had helped me navigate the treacherous waters of aristocratic society, teaching me which rules could be bent and which must be observed. It was Lady Hartwell who had stood beside me at countless functions where I was met with cold stares and cutting remarks, her sharp tongue and sharper wit deflecting the worst of the cruelty. And it was Lady Hartwell who had reminded me, on the days when the weight of judgment felt unbearable, that I had nothing to be ashamed of. "You saved those children," she had told me once, when I was particularly discouraged by yet another cruel piece of gossip. "You gave them love when they had nothing. You gave my brother a reason to keep living when he was drowning in grief. Whatever society thinks of you, Eleanor, history will remember you as the woman who held this family together through impossible circumstances." I had not believed her at the time. But standing at the window now, watching Isabel finally coax James to the highest branch, hearing their triumphant cheers echo across the lawn, I began to think that perhaps she had been right. The day I had been both dreading and preparing for arrived on a golden afternoon in September. James came to find me in the drawing room, where I was reviewing the household accounts with Mrs. Crawford. He stood in the doorway, his small face serious, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture he had unconsciously copied from the Duke. "Mama," he said, and my heart still swelled every time he called me that. "May I speak with you, privately?" Mrs. Crawford excused herself with a knowing look, and I set aside the ledgers and held out my hand. James came to me, climbing into my lap, though he was really getting too big for such things, and I held him the way I had held him that first night when I discovered him crying in a hidden nursery. "What is troubling you, my darling?" He was quiet for a long moment, his head resting against my shoulder. Then, in a small voice, he asked the question I had known would come eventually. "Why do I not remember my real mother?" My breath caught, but I kept my voice steady. "What makes you ask that, James?" "Isabel remembers her. She talks about her sometimes, about how beautiful she was and how she smelled like roses. But I do not remember anything. I try and try, but there is nothing there. Just you." He looked up at me, his hazel eyes confused and a little frightened. "Does that mean I am bad? That I have forgotten?" I gathered him closer, pressing my cheek against his soft hair, and felt tears sting my eyes. "No, my sweet boy, you are not bad. You could never be bad." "Then why?" This was the moment. The one we had known would come, but had hoped to delay for a few more years. But James was asking, and he deserved the truth. The truth we had promised to tell him, with love. "James, do you remember the story I told you about the princess who saved her sister's baby from the dragon?" He nodded against my shoulder. It was a story I had made up years ago, a fairy tale about sacrifice and love and the families we choose. That story was about you, sweetheart, about how you came to us. He pulled back to look at my face. I do not understand. I took a deep breath and began. I told him about Margaret, his birth mother, and how she had been very young and very sick. I told him about Catherine, the Duchess who had loved him the moment she saw him, and who had asked us to raise him as our own. I told him about the promises we had made and the reasons we had kept secrets. I did not tell him about Edward Reeves. That was a truth for another day, when he was older and stronger. For now, it was enough for him to know that he had been wanted, loved, chosen. So the Duke is not my real father, James asked when I finished, and his voice was very small. He is your real father in every way that matters, I said firmly. He chose you, James. He promised your Aunt Catherine that he would love you and protect you and raise you as his son. And he has kept that promise every single day. Blood does not make a family, my darling. Love does. And you are so very loved. James was quiet for a long time, processing everything I had told him. Then he asked, "And you are not my real mother?" The question pierced my heart, but I answered honestly. I did not give birth to you, no, but I have loved you from the moment I met you. I have fed you and held you and sung to you and worried over you every day of your life. I am your mother in every way that matters, just as the Duke is your father. We are your family, James. We will always be your family. He thought about this, his small face serious. Then he said something that made my heart break and heal all at once. I am glad it was you. I am glad you are my mother, because you are the best mother anyone could have. I held him then, held him so tightly he squirmed in protest, and I wept silently into his hair. All the fear I had carried for 5 years, all the worry that he would feel betrayed or abandoned when he learned the truth, dissolved in that moment. He knew, and he loved us anyway. The Duke found us like that, tangled together in the chair, both of us tear-stained but smiling. He understood immediately what had happened. He crossed the room and gathered us both into his arms, and we stayed like that for a long time, the three of us, holding on to each other and the love we had built from such impossible circumstances. That evening, we told Isabel the whole story as well. She listened with the grave attention she brought to everything important, and when we finished, she simply took James's hand and said, "You are still my brother. That will never change." And that was that. The secret was no longer a secret, at least not within our family. The children knew the truth, and they accepted it with the remarkable resilience that children possess when they are secure in their parents' love. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. We watched the children grow, Isabel into a poised young lady with her mother's grace and my determination, James into a bright, curious boy who questioned everything and loved fiercely. We celebrated birthdays and holidays, weathered childhood illnesses and sibling squabbles, created traditions and memories that would bind us together long after we were gone. The Duke and I grew older together, our love deepening with each passing year. We learned each other's habits and preferences, developed our own private language of glances and gestures, built a partnership that was as much about friendship as romance. He still made my heart race when he smiled at me across a crowded room. I still felt a flutter of joy every time he sought me out, just to share some small moment of his day. We faced challenges, of course. There was the year Isabel fell gravely ill with scarlet fever, and we thought we might lose her. There was the scandal when James got into a fight at school defending another boy who was being bullied for his illegitimacy, coming home with a black eye and a suspension, but also with our fierce pride. There were financial difficulties when poor harvests affected the estate, social setbacks when old enemies resurfaced with renewed gossip, and the ordinary struggles of any family trying to navigate a world that was not always kind. But we faced them together. That was what mattered. The Duke and I had learned that love was not the absence of difficulty, but the choice to stay and fight for each other when difficulties arose. And we chose each other, over and over again, through every challenge and every joy. 10 years after I first arrived at Thornfield Hall, we held a ball to celebrate Isabel's coming out. It was the first major social event we had hosted since our marriage, and I was terrified that no one would come, that we would be humiliated by empty ballrooms and pointed absences. But they came. Not everyone, certainly. There were still families who would not associate with us, but enough came to fill the ballroom with music and laughter, to dance and eat and celebrate with us. Some came out of curiosity, perhaps, or because they could not resist the scandal of the Duke's unconventional family. But others came because they had grown to respect us, to see in our story something worth honoring rather than condemning. Isabel was radiant that night, stunning in a gown of pale blue silk, her dark hair dressed with flowers. She danced with young men who looked at her with admiration and longing, and I felt both pride and a mother's natural fear of letting go. James, now 15 and already showing signs of the man he would become, stood at the edge of the ballroom with the Duke, watching his sister with protective fondness. He had grown into his features, tall and handsome in his own right, with Margaret's red hair and a smile that could light up a room. He had inherited his uncle's sense of duty, but also a warmth and openness that drew people to him. I stood beside Lady Hartwell, now silver-haired but still sharp as ever, and watched my family with a heart so full I thought it might burst. "You did well," Lady Hartwell said softly, following my gaze. "You took broken pieces and made something beautiful." "We all did," I corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you." She smiled, and there was something wistful in her expression. "I never married, never had children of my own. But I have had this. This family, these children who call me aunt, this life we built together from scandal and secrets. It has been enough, more than enough." I took her hand and squeezed it, and we stood together in companionable silence, watching the next generation dance and laugh and dream of futures we could only imagine. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children had gone to bed, the Duke and I walked through the gardens under a sky full of stars. It was the same walk we had taken countless times before, but it never grew old. The beauty of Thornfield Hall, once so cold and forbidding, had been transformed by love into something warm and welcoming. "Do you ever regret it?" the Duke asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Marrying me? Taking on all of this?" I stopped walking and turned to face him, studying his face in the moonlight. He was older now, lines etched around his eyes and gray threading through his dark hair. But he was still the most handsome man I had ever known, and more importantly, he was still the kindest. "Never," I said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me a reason to live again when I thought I had none. You gave me children to love when I thought I would never be a mother again. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible." "I gave you scandal and shame," he said, and there was still guilt in his voice, even after all these years. "You gave me love," I corrected, "and that was worth everything else." He pulled me into his arms then, holding me close, and I breathed in the familiar scent of him, felt the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. This was home. Not the grand house or the title or the position in society. This man, these children, this family we had built from grief and secrets and stubborn, impossible hope. "I love you, Eleanor," he whispered against my hair. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," I whispered back, "always." We stood like that for a long time, two people who had found each other in the darkness and had learned to build light together. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to our small human dramas. The house settled into sleep behind us. somewhere in the nursery that was no longer a nursery. Two children who had been born into secrets and raised in love dreamed of the futures they would create. And I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from a cold February morning when I buried my husband and son, to a night of frost and discovery when I found a second baby in a hidden room, to this moment of perfect peace in the arms of a man I loved beyond reason or caution. Life, I had learned, was not a straight path from grief to joy. It was a winding road with unexpected turns, moments of darkness and sudden bursts of light, losses that seemed unbearable, and joys that felt undeserved. We made mistakes and carried regrets. We built families from unconventional materials and loved people we were not supposed to love. But we endured. We survived. And sometimes, if we were very lucky, we found that the broken pieces could be arranged into something beautiful. I had found a second baby in the nursery, and the Duke had begged me not to ask who the mother was. That discovery had led me here, to this garden, this man, this life. And I would not change a single moment of it, not even the painful ones, because they had all been necessary to bring me to this place of belonging. The secret had been revealed. The scandal had been weathered. The children had grown, and love, stubborn and persistent and miraculous, had transformed everything. That was the story I would tell someday when people asked how the widowed governess became the Duchess of Blackwood. Not a fairy tale with easy answers and uncomplicated endings, but a true story, messy and difficult and real. A story about two children who needed a mother, a man who needed to learn how to hope again, and a woman who discovered that it was possible to rebuild a life from ruins. A story about secrets and scandals, grief and redemption, loss and love. A story about family in all its imperfect, beautiful complexity. My story, our story. The story of Thornfield Hall and the second baby in the nursery and the impossible love that saved us all. And as the Duke and I walked back to the house, hand in hand under the stars, I knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where I was meant to be. That everything I had endured, every sorrow and struggle and sacrifice, had been leading me to this moment, this man, this life. I was home, finally, completely, irrevocably home. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.